Have you ever seen a billion-dollar warship that looks like it just came out of a scrapyard? Orange rust streaks running down the hull, peeling paint, and a look that makes people question everything. And then you look at another ship, clean, flawless, not a single blemish, like it just rolled out of a museum. Two ships, two completely different images. And on social media, the conclusion seems obvious. America is declining. China is rising. But what if what you're seeing isn't the truth at all? What if those rust streaks aren't signs of decay, but signs of something entirely different? Right now, out on the ocean, there are ships that simply don't have time to look good. They are on mission, operating nonstop, day after day, in some of the harshest waters on Earth. Sailors getting just a few hours of sleep, not to repaint the ship, but to keep it ready to fight. And that raises a simple question, but not an easy one. Do you want a fleet that looks perfect in photos, or one that shows up when the world needs it? Because in this video, we're going to uncover a truth that few people talk about. About rust, about the ocean, and about the real price of global power. And by the end of this, you may never look at those rust streaks the same way again. This story doesn't begin out at sea. It begins on our phone screens. One image, then another, spreading across social media in just hours. One image, then another, spreading across social media in just hours. On one side, an American ship streaked with rust, like orange tears running down its hull. On the other, a Chinese ship, clean, polished, almost untouched. And then the rest happens quickly. Thousands of comments, millions of views, and a conclusion repeated so often it starts to feel true. Look at this. One is falling apart, the other is rising. But here's the interesting part. Our brains are wired to think that way. We trust what we can see. We judge quality by appearance. A freshly painted house always looks better than an older one, even if the structure is identical. And in everyday life, that way of thinking usually works. But in the military world, especially at sea, things work very differently. Imagine a pickup truck that just drove across a desert covered in dust, scratched and worn. It looks far worse than a brand new one in a showroom. But if you had to cross rough terrain, which one would you choose? The one that's proven it can perform, or the one that's only been sitting still? That's the biggest mistake people make when looking at those warship images. We're judging a tool of war by the standards of a display piece. A warship is not designed to look pretty. It's designed to survive, to operate, and if necessary, to fight. And sometimes, the ugliest marks are the clearest proof that it's doing its job. But if that's true, why do those small rust marks look so dramatic? How can a tiny scratch create streaks that stretch for meters. And what is actually happening on the surface of those ships? To understand that, we need to go a little deeper into something the eye can't see. Not strategy, not politics, but science. Because the real answer begins with tiny reactions happening every second on the ship's steel. And that's where things start to get a lot more interesting. If you stood on the deck and touched the steel under the sun, nothing would seem unusual. But in that exact moment, millions of tiny reactions are happening beyond what the eye can see. The ocean isn't just water, it's a highly aggressive chemical environment for metal. Seawater contains salt, and that salt turns water into a natural conductor. When the protective paint is scratched even slightly, the steel underneath is exposed. And instantly, an electrochemical reaction begins. The iron in the steel reacts with oxygen and water, forming rust. It sounds simple, but the real trick lies somewhere else. Rust doesn't just change the color of metal, it changes its volume. When steel oxidizes, the rust can expand to several times the original metal. That means a tiny scratch, no bigger than a pin, can grow into a rust patch large enough to be seen from a distance. And when rain or seawater washes over the hull, that rust begins to run downward with gravity, creating long dark streaks, making the ship look heavily corroded. But in reality, the actual damaged metal may be just a tiny spot. This is what we call visual amplification. What you see is far greater than what's actually happening. Think of a more familiar example. A car gets a small scratch on its door. After weeks of weather exposure, rust appears and then spreads outward. At a glance, you might think the whole door is damaged. But in reality, it all started from a tiny point. On a warship, this effect is far more dramatic. Because of the massive surface area and the marine environment that amplifies every tiny flaw. And that leads to a very common misunderstanding. Many people assume more rust equals serious structural damage. But in many cases, that simply isn't true. Most of what you see is surface level, not structural. The ship can still be fully safe and combat ready. And that's the key point. Rust is not always a sign of weakness. Sometimes it's just a mark of environment and time. But if it's just science, why do some ships look so much cleaner? Why do some ships appear spotless while others are covered in marks? The answer isn't in the material, it's in how they're used. And to understand that, we need to move beyond the steel and look at where these ships actually operate. Because not all oceans are the same. and how a fleet moves across them can change everything. If you look at the same ocean from two different ships, you'll see two completely different worlds. One ship operates close to shore, where land is always somewhere on the horizon. The other is thousands of miles from home, in waters with no familiar place to stop. In naval terms, there are simple names for these two ways of operating: green water navy and blue water navy. Green water refers to a fleet that operates mainly near its coastline, within reach of its home ports. Blue water means a fleet that can operate continuously across open oceans, thousands of miles away, for months at a time. And the difference between them is not just distance. It's about tempo, pressure, and how a ship lives day to day. A nearshore ship can return to port regularly. It has time to be cleaned, repainted, carefully maintained. Each return is like hitting reset. But for a ship operating far from home, everything changes. A deployment can last 6 months, sometimes longer. There are stretches where land isn't seen for weeks. There is no reset. Everything just keeps going. Imagine a ship like the USS Carney operating in the Middle East. High temperatures, near saturated humidity, and salt in the air at all times. Every day, the ship is exposed to some of the harshest conditions metal can endure. And more importantly, it doesn't stop. Meanwhile, a ship like the Type 055 destroyer often operates closer to its home base. That doesn't mean it's weaker, but it does have the advantage of more frequent access to maintenance. And that alone can create a huge difference in appearance. Think of two vehicles. One drives cross-country, day after day. The other stays in the city and gets washed every week. After a few months, you don't need to be an expert to guess which one looks newer. But if you had to pick one for the next long journey, the answer might be different. That's the real gap between green water and blue water. It's not about who has the better looking ship, but who can keep a ship operating longer, farther, and more consistently. And when you look back at those rust streaks, they may not just be marks of the environment, but marks of the distance that ship has traveled. The time it has spent out there without stopping. And all the missions it has carried out quietly. The lesson here is simple. Appearance often reflects how something is used, not what it's capable of. A ship that looks perfect may have just been resting. A ship that looks worn may have just done its job. But the story doesn't end there. Because even if a ship wanted to stay cleaner, there are forces beyond the crew's control. Not the weather, but regulations, constraints, and difficult choices they face every day. And those are what truly determine why a ship looks the way it does. If you ask a sailor why their ship has rust streaks, the answer is rarely simple. Because sometimes it's not about not wanting to fix it. It's that they're not allowed to. Decades ago, life at sea looked very different. While underway, sailors could hang over the side of the ship. They scraped rust, sanded surfaces, and repainted right there at sea. It was dangerous, but effective. And ships often looked cleaner, even during long deployments. But then, things changed. Environmental regulations were introduced to protect the oceans. Ship paint isn't just color. It contains metals like copper and zinc. When scraped at sea, those particles fall directly into the ocean. And that is no longer acceptable. Today, large-scale rust removal and repainting at sea are largely restricted. Which means what starts at sea often has to wait until the ship returns to port. And sometimes that waiting period lasts for months. But regulations are only part of the story. The rest lies with the people on board. Each ship is a small world with hundreds of people working nonstop. And not everyone can spend their time scraping rust. Because modern ships are more than steel and paint. They are radar systems, weapons, sensors, and complex technology. And all of it needs constant operation, checks, and maintenance. This creates a reality few outsiders see. There is never enough time. And sometimes, not enough people. The same people who could fix rust are often needed to run critical systems. And that's when difficult choices appear. Imagine you're on a ship on deployment. An alert can sound at any moment. You know the ship needs maintenance. But you also know it needs to be ready to fight instantly. What do you choose? Send people out to scrape rust. Or keep them inside to ensure every system is ready. In the real world, the answer is almost always the same. Mission comes first. Appearance comes later. That's not neglect. That's prioritization. And those choices build up over time, creating the rust streaks we see. Not because the ship is forgotten, but because it's being used exactly as intended. The lesson here isn't about metal or paint. It's about how people make decisions when resources are limited. When everything matters, you have to choose what matters most. And on a warship, that almost always means survival and mission success. But if rust is the result of rational choices, then a bigger question still remains. Is that cost worth it? And at a strategic level, what do those rust streaks really say about a fleet's power? To answer that, we need to zoom out beyond a single ship and look at the bigger picture of naval power across the world. When you step back and look at the whole story, those rust streaks are no longer just small details on a ship's hull. They become a bigger question. What does a powerful fleet actually look like? Is it a fleet of spotless ships without a single mark? Or ships that carry the marks of time, environment, and mission? To answer that, we need to look beyond a single ship and examine how a fleet operates on a global scale. Imagine a network stretching across the globe. Ships that don't belong to just one region, but can appear wherever they're needed. From the Middle East to the Pacific to the Atlantic, there are always ships operating without pause. That's what we call global presence. But presence is not free. It consumes time, energy, and the ships themselves. Every day at sea is a day of wear and tear. Every mission adds another layer of strain on both ship and crew. And over time, all of that leaves marks. Rust streaks are part of that cost. Not a sign of failure, but a sign of continuous operation. But let's be honest for a moment. Rust is still a real issue. It costs billions every year to control and repair. And if ignored for too long, it can become a real risk. So, this isn't a story about rust being good. It's a story about trade-offs. Between keeping a ship looking perfect and keeping it ready when it matters. Between image and reality. Let's return to the original question. Do you want a fleet that can show up at any hotspot in the world? Or one that always looks perfect in photos? Because it's very hard to have both at the same time. And that's the strategic truth few people talk about. Global power doesn't always look clean. It often comes with wear, pressure, and imperfect choices. But those are the very things that make presence possible. And in a world where crises can emerge at any moment, the ability to be there often matters more than looking good. The lesson here isn't just about navies. It applies to any system operating under pressure. The things used the most rarely look perfect. Yet those are often the most reliable. So the next time you see a ship streaked with rust, maybe the question shouldn't be what happened to it, but what has it been through? And that answer is worth more than any coat of paint. Because, in the end, a fleet isn't built to be displayed. It's built to show up when no one else can. And sometimes, the price of always being there is the rust we see.